The city, at the zenith of a Saturday in Muharram, 656 AH, existed in a state of suspended tension. The air over Baghdad, a palpable medium of dust and distant smoke, carried not the scent of the Tigris marshes, but the metallic premonition of settled siegecraft. For weeks, the concentric rings of Hulagu Khan's tumen had tightened, a noose woven from Mongol horsehair and Chinese-engineered siege engines. The Abbasid Caliphate, a spiritual and political institution whose lineage traced back 5 centuries to the dynasty's founding, now found its absolute authority circumscribed by earthwork ramparts and the chilling efficiency of foreign arithmeticians calculating trajectories. Caliph al-Mustasim Billah, the 37th of his line, resided within the labyrinthine confines of the Dar al-Khilafah, the palace of the Caliphate. His power, once radiating across the Islamic world from the Maghreb to the Indus, had condensed to the dimensions of council chambers and dwindling treasuries. The institution he embodied, the shadow of God on earth, was confronted by a new cosmology of power, one that measured sovereignty not in religious legitimacy or poetic patronage, but in the submission of fortified cities and the census of able-bodied men. Negotiations, such as they were, had devolved into a macabre ritual. Mongol envoys delivered ultimatums wrapped in the formalities of diplomatic speech. The Caliph's court responded with gifts of goldware and silks, a language of obsolete opulence speaking to a regime that valued grain, steel, and obedience above all. The surrender, when it came, was not a battle but a bureaucratic procedure. On February 10, 1258, the gates of Baghdad were opened. The Mongol command imposed a framework of order upon the act of conquest. A directive was issued. For the city to be spared generalized sack, its population must submit to a process of registration and pacification. Citizens were to evacuate their dwellings and assemble in designated quarters for a census. This was the first layer of the method, the transformation of a populace into a documented, controllable asset. The illusion of procedure masked a foundational violence, the dismantling of home, community, and personal sovereignty as a prerequisite for continued existence. For the royal family and the inner court, a separate, more ominous protocol was activated. A command, delivered not with rage but with the cold clarity of a military dispatch, instructed the Caliph, his immediate sons, his key advisors, and the highest echelons of the Abbasid household to present themselves. The rationale was framed within the conqueror's logic, to discuss the formalities of transition, to ensure the stability of the city through the orderly submission of its symbolic heads. They were to be guests of the Khan, their safety guaranteed. This guarantee was the second layer of the method, the weaponization of trust inherent in hierarchical authority. The institution of the Caliphate, built upon codes of honor and the sacred duty of protection, could not conceive of a parley that was itself the instrument of annihilation. To refuse was to invite immediate and total destruction upon the city. To comply was to walk into a diagram of power whose final lines had not yet been drawn. The departure from the Dar al-Khilafah was a somber inversion of royal progress. There were no banners proclaiming divine favor, no crowds throwing flowers. Instead, a compact column emerged. The Caliph, his sons al-Malik al-Ahmed and al-Malik Abdullah, his chief vizier and chronicler Ibn al-Okami, and a cadre of senior officials and palace intimates. They were escorted not by their own ceremonial guard, which had been disarmed, but by a detail of Mongol Keshig, the imperial guard. Their movement through the city was a silent theater. Citizens, undergoing their own regimented humiliation in the census points, watched the embodiment of 500 years of Islamic sovereignty pass by, surrounded by the stern, fur-clad soldiers of the steppe. The message was meticulous. The apex of the old institution was now in the custody of the new. Their destination was a camp on the outskirts, a city of felt and leather that had sprouted with predatory permanence. Here, the air was different, sharp with the smell of horse dung, dung fires, and cured leather. The spatial organization spoke of a nomadic, militarized efficiency utterly alien to the geometric gardens and vaulted halls of Baghdad. The royal party was housed, not in a prison, but in a segregated compound of large tents. Servants provided food and water. The conditions were not of brutality, but of stark, isolating neutrality. The method here was psychological displacement, removing the symbols of an ancient civilization from their architectural context and placing them in a blank administrative space where all reference of their power were absent. The Caliph was no longer the Caliph. He was a high-value detainee in a processing center. The institution he represented was being physically and conceptually extracted from its seat, rendered inert, and prepared for cataloging. Concurrent with the physical detainment began a parallel process, the systematic inventory of the Caliphate's tangible legacy. Mongol scribes, working alongside Persian bureaucrats who had transferred their administrative loyalty, entered the palaces and treasury. This was not mere looting, it was a clinical audit. Volumes from the House of Wisdom were stacked and crated for transport to Karakoram. Astronomical instruments were disassembled. Gold dinars were counted and weighed. Jeweled regalia was itemized. Each object was a unit of cultural and political capital being transferred from one ledger to another. The most symbolic act in this process was the methodical destruction of the caliphal regalia itself. The Abbasid black banners, the inscribed seals of state, the sacred relics, these were not stolen. They were defaced, burned, or melted down. The purpose was erasure through bureaucracy. The authority of the Abbasids was being literally decommissioned, its artifacts stripped of their numinous power and reduced to raw materials, precious metals, combustible cloth, historical curiosities. This operation sent a clear, silent signal to the detained royal family. Your past is already being archived as a closed chapter. Your future is a matter of logistical calculation. The continuity you embodied is fractured. You are witnessing the posthumous processing of your own reign, days passed within the compound. The deference shown was formal, hollow. Guards maintained a perimeter. Requests for clarification about the future, about terms, were met with opaque assurances that the great Khan Hulagu would attend to the matter personally. This period of waiting was the final component of the first phase. It was a pressure chamber of uncertainty. The initial shock of capture gave way to a grinding anxiety, punctuated by the distant, echoing sounds of a city being methodically reordered. The shouts of census-takers, the occasional crash of a cleared building, the steady traffic of wagons leaving the treasury. The psychological architecture of the event was now complete. The royal family existed in a state of suspended animation, isolated from their source of power, surrounded by the evidence of its dismantling, awaiting a verdict from a ruler whose concepts of justice and mercy were utterly alien to their own. The formalities of their world had been used as the conduit for their own neutralization. The siege of Baghdad had ended. The siege of the Abbasid soul had entered its most critical stage. Hulagu Khan did not hold court in a throne room, but within the functional space of his great command tent. The setting was a manifestation of nomadic authority, carpets over grass, a simple seat, the air holding the chill of the plains despite brazier's heat. When the Caliph and his sons were brought before him, the encounter was not between two sovereigns, but between a system of living history and a force of historical reckoning. Hulagu, grandson of Genghis, embodied the Yasa, the supreme law of the Mongol Empire, which recognized only submission or obliteration as valid political conditions. The Caliph represented the divine mandate, a legitimacy drawn from prophecy and bloodline. The two cosmologies did not conflict, they simply failed to recognize each other. The exchange, as later chronicled by those who survived the court, was a study in dissonance. The Caliph, adhering to the protocols of his station, is said to have offered counsel on the responsibilities of power, warning that the wrath of God would fall upon those who harmed the shadow of God. Hulagu's reported reply was neither a rebuke nor a negotiation. It was a statement of material fact. He reportedly gestured to the chests of gold and jewels from the treasury and asked what use they had been in defending the city. He spoke of the strength that comes from unity and discipline, contrasting it with the Abbasid reliance on fractured armies and hollow ceremony. The audience was not a parley, it was a pedagogical demonstration. Its purpose was to make the captive institution witness the intellectual and practical framework that had rendered it obsolete. The verdict was delivered not with a sentence, but with an irrefutable logic. Following the audience, a new phase of containment began. The royal family and senior officials were separated. The method shifted from collective psychological pressure to individualized administrative processing. Each member was subjected to detailed interrogation by a panel of Mongol officials and Persian translators. The questions were precise, exhaustive, and devoid of apparent malice. They concerned treasury accounts, land grants, the loyalties of provincial governors, the network of religious endowments, the lineages of other Abbasid scions across the Islamic world. This was not an inquisition for secrets of state. The state was already conquered. It was an act of cartography. The interrogators were drawing the final, complete organizational chart of the Abbasid power structure, from its financial arteries to its most distant familial capillaries. The process was degrading in its clinical nature. Scribes recorded every answer. Discrepancies between accounts were noted without accusation. The message was implicit. Your institution is being fully documented so that it can be fully understood and thus fully nullified. Your knowledge has value only as it contributes to its own administrative obituary. For the prisoners, the experience was a unique form of torment. They were not being tortured for defiance. They were being used as archival sources. Their very memories, the intimate knowledge that constituted their claim to governance, were being extracted and filed away, transforming living authority into inert data for the Mongol Imperial Archive. A strict information quarantine was imposed upon the compound. Guards were rotated from distant units with no knowledge of Arabic or Persian. Communication between the segregated detainees was forbidden. All servants attending them were Mongol or from Central Asian tribes, creating a wall of linguistic and cultural isolation. The outside world, the city of Baghdad, the wider Islamic Ummah, was denied any direct witness. This created a vacuum of certainty, a space where rumor could fester, but fact could not solidify. Within this vacuum, the Mongol administration began to craft the official narrative. Chronicles were commissioned from compliant scholars within the city. The fall of Baghdad was framed not as a massacre, but as the inevitable consequence of weak leadership and divine retribution for corruption. The fate of the Caliph was rendered ambiguous. Word was selectively leaked that he and his family were being treated with honor, perhaps to be exiled or given a ceremonial role under Mongol suzerainty. This strategic ambiguity served multiple purposes. It discouraged immediate revolt from a population clinging to hope. It prevented the emergence of a clear martyr figure, and it allowed the actual proceedings to continue behind a curtain of plausible deniability. The institution was not just being physically dismantled. Its historical narrative was being surgically rewritten in real time, with its own former scribes and bureaucrats drafted to legitimize the process. The precise date remains obscured by the very secrecy that was enforced, but the event itself followed a grim, orderly template. The decision had been made, likely within Hulagu's inner council and in consultation with his chief advisors, including the Buddhist monk Nagakura and the Chinese general Hulagu Khan. The reasoning was realpolitik rendered as a spiritual and political necessity. The continued existence of the Abbasid Caliph, even in captivity, represented a latent focal point for rebellion. His symbolic power was too potent to be left circulating, even as a prisoner. The institution required not just defeat, but a definitive, unmistakable end. The execution method was chosen with deliberate symbolic weight. In Mongol tradition, the shedding of royal blood upon the earth was an ill omen. The solution was a method of execution that avoided this: death by trampling or by being rolled in carpets and crushed. Historical accounts vary on the specifics but converge on the core principle: a death that was absolute, humiliating in its mechanics, and which adhered to a step taboo. It was a death that treated the royal body not as a sacred vessel, but as logistical problem to be solved cleanly. The Caliph, his sons, and his closest male heirs were processed in this manner. The act was carried out not by a frenzied mob, but by a detail of executioners following a procedure. It was administrative homicide. Immediately following, the bureaucratic machinery engaged once more. The bodies were disposed of in an unmarked location, their graves lost to purpose and time. A formal report was drafted for dispatch to the great Khan monk in Karakoram. It would have contained the necessary facts: the surrender of the city, the capture of its leadership, the orderly transfer of treasury assets, and the neutralization of the Abbasid dynastic threat. The language would have been dry, factual, devoid of the words massacre or atrocity. It would speak of pacification, consolidation, and the implementation of the Yasa. Within the camp and the occupied city, a blanket of enforced normalcy descended. The census of the population continued. Markets were ordered to reopen under new oversight. The remaining Abbasid bureaucrats were given a choice: swear loyalty to the new administration and continue their clerical functions, or share the fate of their patrons. Most chose to serve. The system demanded continuity in operations, even as the head of the organism had been severed. The great, silent work of erasure was not in the act of killing, but in the seamless, paper-shuffling transition that followed it. The institution of the Caliphate was gone. In its place was a filing system, a tax ledger, and a silent, terrified understanding that the past was a country that could no longer be visited. In the weeks following the event, Baghdad underwent a metamorphosis of silence. The physical absence was not of buildings, though many lay in ruins, but of a central nervous system. The Dar al-Khilafah stood emptied, not raised. Its halls, once vibrating with the minute protocols of state, now echoed with the footsteps of Mongol inventory clerks. The silence here was administrative, the hush of an archive being assembled from a living entity. The palace became a museum of itself, its objects tagged for shipment east, its very purpose rendered historical in the span of days. For the citizens, the absence was more pervasive. The call to prayer still sounded, but the figure whose name was invoked in the khutbah, the Caliph, was gone. The line of succession, unbroken for half a millennium, had vanished into a secret plot of earth. The institution had not been replaced, it had been deleted, leaving a theological and political vacuum that hummed with dread. The Mongol administration filled this vacuum not with a new monarch, but with a grid. Military governors, darghatches, were installed. The city was divided into manageable quarters. The surviving ulama and bureaucrats were incorporated into a new hybrid bureaucracy reporting to Tabriz and Karakorum. The silence was enforced by this new order. Open mourning for the fallen dynasty was discouraged, treated as a potential act of sedition. Grief was driven inward, becoming a private liturgy. Public life recalibrated around the mundane necessities of survival under new masters. The erasure was so total that it created a new normalcy with terrifying speed. The unimaginable had happened, and the city, in its exhaustion, was forced to imagine a future constructed entirely upon its ruins. While the central Abbasid line was extinguished, tendrils of the family had existed across the Islamic world, in Cairo, in Syria, in isolated strongholds. The Mongol policy toward them was an extension of the same institutional logic, neutralization. Some were tracked down through the intelligence gathered during the interrogations. Covert operations, offers of safe conduct that mirrored the traps sprung in Baghdad, or outright military actions were employed. The goal was systematic pruning, not annihilation for its own sake. The institution was to be prevented from regenerating from any surviving node. This scattering had a paradoxical effect. It diaspored the memory. Survivors and their descendants carried the story not as a formal history, but as a whispered trauma, a familial ghost story of unimaginable betrayal and loss. These fragments of memory, dispersed from Aleppo to Andalusia, became imperfect, haunting echoes of the whole. They resisted the official Mongol narrative by their very existence, but they were too fractured, too terrified to coalesce into a counter-narrative. They became a legacy of silence, a history told in glances and half-words, where the full truth was too dangerous to speak aloud and too painful to forget. The official record of the event was sculpted with care. Persian historians in Mongol service, such as Malik Juvani, wrote accounts that acknowledged the fall of Baghdad and the death of the Caliph, but framed it within a grand narrative of divine providence and the transfer of the mandate of heaven to a new, vigorous order. The focus was on the administrative brilliance of the conquest, the restoration of order, and the foolish intransigence of al-Mustasim. The methodical, clinical nature of the royal family's demise was glossed over, obscured by general descriptions of the city's sack or transformed into a vague, almost natural demise. In stark opposition, the echoes from the victim's side emerged slowly, choked with trauma. The historian Ibn al-Athir, writing from Mosul, called it a catastrophe such as I shall neither describe nor speak of, for it makes the hair white and destroys the young. His was not a record but a lamentation, an admission of failure before the enormity of the horror. These accounts were not histories in the institutional sense. They were cries etched onto parchment, fragmented, emotional, and often circulated secretly. They contained the raw data of loss, lists of scholars killed, libraries burned, lineages ended, but struggled to articulate the cold, systematic architecture of the event itself. The true history resided in the gap between the sterile Mongol report and the shattered Islamic lament. The most potent symbol of the erasure was the unknown grave. The bodies of the Caliph and his sons were not interred with the rituals befitting their station. They were disposed of, their location unrecorded and unmourned. This was the final, brutal stroke of institutional annihilation. In the medieval Islamic world, the tomb of a saint or a ruler was a place of memory, continuity, and political legitimacy. It was a physical anchor for lineage. By denying this, the Mongols severed the Abbasids not only from the present and future, but from the sacred geography of the past. There was no place to pilgrimage, no cenotaph to curse or to venerate. The absence was made geographical, permanent. This unmarked earth became a metaphor for the event itself. It was a hole in the historical record, a silence where a dynasty's end should have been. It forced the memory to become spectral, untethered from any physical point of reference. The legacy was not a monument, but a question mark etched into the landscape. It whispered that power, no matter how ancient or sanctified, could be made to disappear without a trace, absorbed into the indifferent soil by the careful hands of a new regime. The Abbasid Caliphate did not return. A shadow caliphate was later established in Cairo under Mamluk patronage, but it was a puppet institution, a useful political tool devoid of independent sovereignty. The real caliphate died in the Mongol camp outside Baghdad. Its true legacy is not a line of succession, but a paradigm shift. The event demonstrated with horrifying clarity that no institution is eternal. It revealed that authority derived from God, tradition, and history could be invalidated by a superior system of organization, mobility, and applied force. It introduced the concept of total, systematic erasure as a tool of statecraft, not the chaotic destruction of barbarians, but the calculated, bureaucratic dismantling of a competing source of legitimacy. The silence that followed was not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of a profound, unhealed fracture. It is the silence that hangs over archived interrogation transcripts, in the blank spaces on genealogical tables, and in the unanswered questions about a specific patch of earth by the Tigris. The story does not conclude. It does not offer lessons or redemption. It simply terminates, leaving behind only the chilling echo of a process completed, and the permanent, institutional silence of an empty throne.